not so long ago, our characters used to be just pointy polygons and just flat shading on top of all of this. And nowadays, we kind of expect more. And as a matter of fact, we expect our characters to be lifelike in order to bring the stories to life. And in more and more cases, it's our stories to tell. Our digital twins have come from simple 2D images to full-on 3D characters that take our place in conference calls or the social gathering. And in about 20 years, we've seen these characters come to life. And as the next 20 years will bring even more avatars into the world, I want to take the time to look at some of the key techniques we've been using in order to do this. But also I want to see if maybe we've reached the end of what we can do in terms of realistic humans. I also want to inspire you to be part of these next 20 years by highlighting some of the challenges we still have to face and try to extract some common goals for us to look at. So I'm Thomas. I'm a principal rendering engineer. I've been working at Ubisoft as a AAA graphics engineer, and as you may pick up through the slides, I have a great interest in human rendering and anything that's related to translucent materials. And before we go further into the talk, I want to apologize to fellow graphics engineers in the room that may pick up on some of the things I'm going to say here as being oversimplification of the topics. But this is, after all, an entry-level talk, and I want everybody here in the room to be able to understand the concepts and really what are all these terms about. So the next time your graphics engineers come to you and talk about BSSRDF or whatnot nonsense, you may know what he's talking about. So here is a contract between you and me. No function, no equation, no mathematical expression. This is all about the concept. And without further ado, let's start straight up with BRDF. All right, no jokes aside, we're still going to start with BRDF, and BRDF is the bidirectional reflectance distribution function. And you can already forget about all of this, because the concept there is it's a mathematical expression between the light coming in on a surface and the light coming out of a surface. And we often represent it that way. It's like a two-lobe diagram where we have the diffuse component, it's like big circle, where you can see all the colors of the surface you are looking at in any kind of direction. And we also have the specular highlight, it's like the more pointy bit there. And that specular highlight appears the closer your camera gets to a 90 degrees angle with the light. And we could go on and basically model everything like this. Simple flat plane, but that, I'm sure, if we put that to a test, again, real-life content, it will fail to pass any test because, well, if we take a microscope to a piece of rock and we actually look closely at the surface, we'll realize that actually our piece of rock is not a simple flat plane. It's actually lots of small surfaces all pointing in very random direction. And that is the main concept behind the microfacet theory, behind which most of our PBR engine that we are using are based. And now if you are an artist in the room, you probably look at this and start to scratch your head because, well, you never ever model all these tiny facets yourself, right? Like, you never did this, or like, never ever would a technical artist would let you bring that in-game, right? It makes no sense. It's actually because we have mathematical way to represent these surfaces. And I won't go into the details so much of these mathematical equations, but there's one element I want to talk about is the distribution function. And you may be familiar with that distribution function through the roughness factor. So when you're playing with a roughness factor in your engine, what you're doing is actually defining the distribution of these facets. The higher the roughness factor, the more spread and like the more randomly they will look, and the more rougher your surface will be, the more wider your specular. And the less rough your surface, the more mirror-like will be, and the more the specular will be pointing in one direction. So that's enough for the theory, and let's start to look into a bit of our topic. So velvet, right? It's a very interesting and very distinctive material with very distinctive specular response. And it's actually not shaded like that podium here. It's the specular response is quite interesting, and that's again if we bring our microscope back to our piece of velvet here, the observation we can make is not a lot of small surfaces, but it's actually small translucent strands, all pointing in different directions. And the key thing about these little strands is, since they are translucent, the top part of the strand is not the interesting bit. It's actually the slanted part where the light is going to act. And that's based on this observation that Ashekmin made in the 2000s, that he developed a model based on the distribution, based on the microfacet model, and by slightly tweaking the distribution function and the roughness factor and how it was used in the equation, he was able to really accurately capture this effect. And what we have here on the left is actually two balls. They're all covered with lots of tiny strands, like a piece of velvet would be. And in one case, we have the light behind the camera. And what we have there is like a strong backscattering effect. As the light goes onto the ball, it reflects on the slanted part of the strand back to the camera and produces that specular effect. And the second case is the light is now behind the ball, and what you see is a forward scattering effect. So the light goes through the strands and to the camera. So I've been talking about these strands quite a lot, and this is what they look like up close. It's little cylinders, and regardless of the type of strand we use in fabric, it's always the same kind of look they have. So the thing is, all of these little strands, also of these little threads, they are what makes the surface. If we look at that bull jumper here, that's actually a bit hard to see there on that screen, but it's all fuzzy, it's all blurry in the middle, and that's because of these little threads and they act. And when I was preparing these slides, I actually went on ArtStation and found this great materials of wool, but the material is great, the shading is great. I think everything is perfectly captured inside the ball, but it's missing one thing, it's a silhouette. It's missing all these little strands are just popping out of the main strands to create the silhouette around. So I think there's definitely a case to be made that, to some extent, thread-level rendering would help us in that case. For fabric like damask or jacquard, the multiple surface look is what is key to producing these effects. We have the fuzzy part like velvet, we have the shiny bit like silk, or very strongly textures. Or like in fabric like shot silk, that was all the craze in the 1800s, we actually have two different color threads that are weave in a different pattern in order to produce this kind of very typical specular response that depends on where you look. It's either one thread or the other that takes precedence. So thread-level rendering would definitely enable a whole new range of effect and possibilities in terms of fabric rendering. It's an area that offline rendering has been looking at, and I hope soon we will be able to do the same in real-time rendering. But speaking about new range, I also want to talk about translucent rendering in case of fabric, because we've taken the easy option for way too long in real-time rendering by considering the cloth to be simply fully opaque, which it isn't. If we look at that dress and how it folds on itself, that's what creates the interesting part. That's what creates the volumes. That's what really is important there. But the problem is translucency is extremely hard. Probably if you are a graphics developer, you know these slides from Morgan Maguire, the presentation he made in 2016. Very interesting. The thing is, what he was talking back in 2016, the problems are still the same, and we still don't have good solutions. Techniques like order-independent transparency do work well, but they are expensive both in terms of computation and memory requirements. And scaling these will be extremely challenging, only looking at 4K or 4K plus resolution. All right, so I guess we all know what this is. This is not a wool strand, actually, but this is a hair strand. And the point I want to make here is hair strands are actually a lot better understood than fabric strands. Already back in 1989, KJK was forming the first model, and it does not look perfect, but it gets quite close to reality. And already back in 2003, Marshner did some improvements on that model in order to get something that is really quite close to reality, and is a model that is widely used in all the real-time engines. So let's break it down a little bit to see how it works. So what Marshner did was to look at these hair fibers as little cylinders and try to mathematically express the travel of the light inside that cylinder. And we start with the light reflecting directly on the cylinder, and that's what we call the air path for reflect. And it's like any other surfaces. It will create that white specular band. And now if we continue a little bit, now that the hairs can also go through the strands and back on the other side, and that's what we call the TT path for transmit. It's the forward scattering effect I was talking previously, and it happens when the light is behind the subject and usually appears in dramatic shots when you have sunrise or sunset and the character is in front of the sun. And finally, we have another reflection that happens, and the rays come at the other side, and it's a TRT path for transmit, reflect, and transmit, and you probably start to see the logic behind the naming. But it's what creates these vivid color bands, because as the light goes through the hair strands, it actually charges itself in lots of colors and come out to the other side. So now we could go on and on and on and add lots more passes, but the fact is, as the light goes through, it dissipates so much energy that past the TRT pass, it's probably irrelevant to look further. What is not irrelevant, though, is the light, as it goes through, does scatter. You know, when it comes on the other side, it's scattered to other strands, and it builds up and it's scattered. And that scattering effect is key to capturing lighter colored hair, where the light is not so much absorbed by the color of the hair strands and dissipate into the volume. Problem is that handling at this kind of scale and this kind of volume is really hard, and research is very much still ongoing. All right, so now I want to do a little game and a little break with you. So this is Eloy. She's the main character of a series of a game called Horizon on PlayStation. And being the main character on a third-person game, you can see her quite a lot. And she has a lot of hairs. And yes, the question I want to put up to you is, let's do a quick show of hands. How long did you think it took an artist to do the Eloy's hair? So let's start with 1 day. Okay, nobody thinks in 1 day. That's, oh, you do? So I have 1 week. So we have 1 week. Okay. I have 3 weeks. Does anybody think 3 weeks? Okay, a couple of 3 weeks. 1 month, maybe? Right. We start to get a bit more realistic. So I kind of tricked you in that case, because we don't really, like, it's not public how long it took, but the artist that made Eloy's hair said it took him about 1 to 2 years to develop only the technique to do the hairs correctly. And it's not uncommon in AAA studios that your main character's hair groom would take 3 to 4 months to get from concept to reality. And the reason behind this is the way we do hairs in games are actually, I'm not sure if we can really see from far back, but it's lots of poly strips, think about lots of little rectangles put together with textures on top to imitate the hairs. And all these poly strips need to be placed by experts, because they need to have a special arrangements in order to cover everything, and you don't see the scalp regardless of which direction you look from. And this process takes a lot of time, requires extremely trained artists in order to do correctly. It is extremely inflexible. If your budgets change, if your polygon budget change, or if your frame budget change, whatever, or if you scale from platform from PS5 to, say, Switch, you may have to redo all these assets every time. And I don't know for you, but at least for me, my hairs are not really little cards put on top of my head. They're actually strands. And the fact is, we do have tools to model with strands. XGen, for example, in Maya has been widely used by artists, and it's quite great to use because you can just use digital brushes, you can use digital scissors, and it's a very intuitive process. And it's a topic very close to me because I've been dedicated a lot of time to this topic. But what about rendering the strands directly? What if we take that raw data that an artist has been doing and just render that instead of doing these cards in the middle? For one, it would help us to better capture high curliness, because unlike the cards, they don't have edges that are constraining the geometry. Thankfully, with advance in hardware and a more compute power available to us as outside of the fixed pipelines that we've just seen before, that's something that the industry is finally moving towards too, and some games have already been shipping with this kind of technology. And if you're interested, I really do encourage you to check a talk by the Frostbite team that talked about how they used this in FIFA. So let's change our focus a little bit. I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept of the uncanny valley, which has been widely overused. But the concept is real, right? Like when you look at a human that is not quite right, that's a bit waxy, that doesn't feel right, you feel uneasy. And that's because through millennia of evolution, we've been trained to detect all these small details unconsciously, all of what's wrong. And especially the eyes, because when we talk with someone else, the eyes are the important vector of information. That's how we detect emotion. That's how we can detect what the people is thinking about. And if you're looking at this picture now, and you're probably trying to piece out why it's there, and maybe you're feeling slightly uneasy at the left one. So because there's like one little thing missing. If you look closely on the edge of the iris, there's a little bit more light. And this is what we call the caustic. The caustic is basically the same effect that when you look at your pool with the light hitting just right and it forms a nice shiny pattern at the bottom. It's the action of the light refracting on the cornea and directly projecting on the iris. Problem is, if we want to do this right, it's a lot of calculation, it's a lot of rays we need to accumulate, and it's not really practical in real time. So in that case, thanks to a technique introduced by Jimenez in 2013, we were able to pre-compute that offline in a past tracer, get the correct physical results, and by baking this in lookup textures that uses the IUV and the angle to the light as parameters, we can sample in real time all of that information and produce the image that we've seen before. And another example of these kind of great details is if we look at teeth. The teeth have multiple layers that are all scattering the light, but on top there's a small water layer. And that water layer is fully transparent, it has no color, it doesn't change anything, but it adds another little specular. So if we bring back our lobe diagram, here it is, and we know we're going to add our water layer. And what it does is add another specular, but slightly shifted up along the normal direction. And you can see like these kind of simple tricks can be used to great effect in order to enhance the realism of our characters. So now we're going to do a little experiment. I'm sure we all done this as kids when we play. We take our hands, it's fully opaque, and then we start to shine a line through, and it gets red. That's a bit weird because our hands are like actually opaque, so why does the light go through? Turns out our skin is composed of multiple semi-opaque layers that let the light shine through and peek on the other side. And that effect is what we call the subsurface scattering. Or if we want to go with the mathematical terms that we use it to describe it, is a BSS-RDF, or bidirectional scattering surface reflection distribution function. That's a bar break name, but the concept is very simple, right? It's all about the light entering the surface, scattering below the surface, and exiting at different points. Now, if you are doing offline rendering, that's great because it's quite simple. You just fire a ray. The ray does its things on the surface, at the other side, you accumulate the result, perfect. But in real time, we can't really do this because what we are interested is not so much where it goes out, but all the places where the light enters the surface, scattered below in order to exit at the point we are actually looking at. So how can we do this in real time? So we have a couple of tricks up our sleeves, and here's another lookup texture. And that technique is called like pre-integrated skin and was introduced by Penner in 2011. The idea is we take the curvature of the surface on that axis, and we take the angle to the light. And by making all these complex calculations of the scattering of the light, we're able to produce this that we can easily sample in real time. The good thing is, since we can pack a lot of calculation into these textures, we can also introduce the absorption. And the absorption under the skin is what the melanin is doing, and is key to capturing the wide range of skin colors that we can find throughout the world. But now you're probably wondering that that lookup texture I show is great for everything that is above the skin, right? Like, but what if the light is behind, as I was talking in the beginning? So for that, we have the transmission. And the transmission is all about trying to estimate the distance the light has traveled inside the mesh. And for that, if we have a shadow map, we're in luck because it's quite simple, because the shadow map is really just a representation of the distance between the light and our surface. And if we have the distance that we actually do between the camera and the other side of the surface with a little bit of mathematics, it's really easy to find this. And then we apply again our absorption factor, and we get good results. That is, unless either we don't have a shadow map, or there's something else in the middle. Because if there's something else, that intersection point is not really the same mesh, then it makes no sense. And especially in case of humans, it do happen when you have concave shapes around the ears or around the nostrils. So how can we really solve this? I'm sure you've all heard about ray tracing, right? It's been used for reflection, it's been used for global illumination, it's been used for shadows. But when I started to look into ray tracing, I wanted to look at innovative uses and how I could use this for human rendering. So I settled on something that is quite close to what EA did for the Pika Pika demo back in 2018. We start by exporting a set of additional G buffers, in that case normals in the world position. We generate a list of rays we're going to have to fire, and that is interesting because we can take this information and actually pre-process it in order to batch the rays for performance reasons. Once that is done, we emit the rays, and that's, instead of emitting towards the light, we're going to emit them towards the inside of the mesh in order to simulate the travel of the light and have perfect intersection. So if the mesh is concave or something, it will be perfectly captured. Once we have these intersection points, we accumulate them into a buffer, and now the frame does its things. And finally, when we come to the rasterization of our main object, we can sample from this texture. And here's some results for you to look at. I think the results speak for themselves, right? Like, we have good details around the nostrils, it doesn't bleed through, or same here around the ears, it doesn't bleed through either, it gets properly captured. And the good thing about using that accumulation buffer is we can also accumulate it over time. If our character doesn't move too much, or if our light setup doesn't move, we can actually accumulate over time and reduce the number of rays we have to fire. All right, so just before wrapping up, it's fair to say that our players are expecting more and more customization options. They want really to make the characters as close as possible from what they want, and they want to be able to tweak it through face paint or tattoos. And the problem is enabling that unlimited amount of customization is quite complicated. If we follow classic solution, we would have different mask layers at different position. We would have different options for textures that they can place in these different locations we predefined. But what if our players want an arm full covered of tattoos, or like the whole body covered of tattoos? And if you remember the previous talk, we start to have a problem because then we have lots of textures that we need to sample, and just sampling black to say, hey, there's no tattoo here, and then go on and on and on for that unlimited amount. It's a bit tricky. But if we add an even trickier bit, what if the face paint, what if that part would be metallic? What if that part would have glitter? Then we also have variation in the shading that we should use. That's where a technique that is, I think, very interesting could come into play, is texture space shading. The idea of texture space shading is we start to decouple the shape, the rasterization, and the actual shading, and think about it as just textures that we apply on top. Because what we could do is offline, at a different point in the frame, we could just shade everything in a new UV space. We apply our first texture, let's say metallic blue texture, and then we come afterwards and we apply just on that region specifically that pattern. And that way we don't have to just mask it and just test everywhere if that lightning bolt should be rendered or not. but it's also useful when we treat subsurface scattering in a different way. Another way to do subsurface scattering is actually by just blurring the whole screen and using something as a stencil mask to choose the sections that actually have the subsurface scattering. Well, by using this technique, it's actually quite a lot simpler because we can just render our skin texture, do the blurring just on that texture, and continue to apply at different layers of effects that shouldn't be affected by the subsurface scattering. All right, so is this the end of this presentation? Most certainly. But if you remember at the beginning, I asked you questions. Is this the end of human rendering? Are we done with all of what we can do? So what would IGDC 2036 be like? In my opinion, I think it's a case of 90% of the work in 10% of the time. We've made tremendous work from going from pointy polygons to very smooth skin. It does look real, but there's, I hope I've convinced you through some of the examples I've shown, a wide range of things that we still have to do. And we talk about thread level rendering for fabric and cloth shading, but what about fur on cloth? And what about frost forming on the fur and the cloth dynamically as a character breathes? I've talked about subsurface scattering for skin, but, and excuse me for this one, but skin lives with us. As we exercise, the sweat spurts on it. And as we are cold or afraid, goosebumps forms on the surface. There are unsolved challenges everywhere. I haven't talked even about animation and physics. Frankly, these topics would require their own presentation of several hours if I want to do any justice there. But the one thing I want you to take away is translucency is in everything human. Look at the hairs on the side of that ear, or like the vein impacting the density in the subsurface scattering, or the wrinkles affect the specules. Nothing is a simple, smooth, opaque surface. The details in all of this are what will create a truly realistic human. The good thing is, translucency is also actually in everything nature. We have crossovers with many topics. Look at how the density in the leaves impacts the scattering or the transmission as the light goes through, or again, little hairs on the side of that leaves. What I think is we have pretty exciting times ahead of us, and there's quite a lot to tackle in the coming 20 years. So, before opening the floor to questions, I would like to thank Rupesh and the organizer to having me here today, and all the people listed here that have been making up with all my rambling about human rendering and translucency over the years, and without whom these talks wouldn't have been possible. Thank you very much.
We have 5 minutes for questions.
This was a nice presentation. Thanks for that.
Thank you very much.
Actually have a questions. So these the subsurface scattering shaders, or maybe the reflections, or is it how it will far we can we are struggling in the Android devices, like mobile hand devices. So I'm from Bosch. We are having a digital twin on the infotainment system, maybe AI guidelines character. So these are the things we are working on. But the thing is, we are struggling on the getting that actual quality, that the rendering of the character should be there. No, how this OEMs are looking in when it's come to the large number of audience. They are looking into that how the movie characters looks. They want it in that infotainment system also. So here we are, trying to bridge this. So actually, the question is how we will be bridge this, or how far we are to bridge this, and I need some sort of ideas to our team need to be grow further.
So if I understand the question right, is like, so you are doing something inside, like closer to a mobile market and like this kind of quality, and what would be the first step you can take to get closer to movie quality?
Movie quality or AAA qualities.
Right.
The market is bigger now, and the audience is expecting that, actually.
Yes. It's a good question. Oh God. I think there's quite a lot we could discuss together at the end afterwards, but to me it starts with identifying the key things that you can see in your characters. So if it depends, like if your characters is centered on the head and lots of hairs, then maybe that's the part. Like skin is a big factor. You know, like having proper skin with proper surface coloring will go a very long way to bring up the quality and the realism. I would try to invest some time in surface coloring to try to nail that one down. Maybe something as simple as pre-integrated skin, if that's not something you already have, that could be a good thing to start and go a big way. Hairs is also a good one. I think a model closer to something like Marshner would definitely help. Yeah, I guess that's as much I can give without more context, but feel free to come at the end and we can have a better discussion there.
Sure. Thank you so much.
So I have a quick question. So this is we are working with infrared cameras. So we are trying to replicate how materials works in infrared cameras. So if you consider something like if you see animals in the dark, you see their eyes lit up, as which does not happen in RGB cameras, and the difference between like materials behave different way in IR cameras and RGB cameras. We are trying to bridge the gap between RGB and IR in a virtual world. So do you have any research done on that front, or like are there any papers where we can refer to or do something like that?
So I guess that would be looking more towards spectral rendering. And that is a big topic in itself. And I'm probably the wrong person to answer, but...
Okay, so this texture, space, shattering and multi-layer materials, these have something to... like we are trying to replicate the same, like I need to see you in RGB, and also it should be same as how real life IR works.
Right. Yeah, so I guess in that case, if you want to get that level of rendering, it's probably spectral rendering, so you would decouple yourself from RGB concepts and consider everything in wavelengths. And that's probably the closest you can get to that. The texture spacing is a way to either save computation on time per scale. That's something I didn't talk about here. Is you can actually pre-compute everything, store everything in partially resident texture, and then stream that. Now, I don't see how it could fit in terms of spectral rendering.
I mean, people consider IR as a black and white image, but there is a lot of thing into that.
Oh, it's a bit more complicated than that, isn't it? And I mean, it's a very interesting topic, but it's getting slightly off topic from that talk. So maybe we can talk about it afterwards.
Yeah.
Because I'm definitely interested in spectral rendering, but it's a bit different.
Right. So we are seeing this deface lab and deepfake coming up, right? So do you think that the rendering thing will change and kind of like what NVIDIA is doing with DLSS, something the like real-time rendering will actually transfer to this deepfake kind of stuff, like the games will have realistic humans, but that will be more like a deepfake thing?
So if I understand your question, is like the implication of the
which side the
deepfakes.
research is moving now? Like, is it more focused on how to render humans, or like will it be AIs which will be actually rendering? Because deface lab and deepfake are very realistic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
to me, it's the ability to do it in real time that probably deepfakes don't really have. And I'm no expert on AI. I'm like, I don't really believe in AI for really real-time rendering. And I actually prefer AMD solution to DLSS. But no, it's an interesting question. I think in the case of real-time rendering, there's like both a question of are we going too far, and like the deepfakes, the same kind of questions that we need to ask ourselves there. But it also, I lost my train of thought there for a second. No, I think it does have a purpose because it's the ability to map a character in real time to different scenarios and adapt it to different region, different crowds, and make something. Like if you take, for example, a live translator in sign language, right? You would be able to have through AI map the gestures on the character, but then have that character be adapted to different regions, to different crowd, to different market, and that I think makes more sense to do it with real-time rendering than AI.
Because I just want to add like Mandalorian or those kind of shows, like they are bringing in Luke Skywalker, yeah, and it is completely created now in deepfake because they tried with the digital rendering, didn't work. So maybe they are trying to bring it on the game side, or I don't know, like.
I think it boils down to how long do you need to do a frame. Like if it's more than 16 milliseconds, then it's out.
Correct. Thank you.
So thanks for the talk. Quick question: can you talk a bit about the aliasing for the thread level rendering? Like, what's the state of the art there? How is it going? Like, does it look good? Like,
If you are offline and you have 14 hours to render a frame, yes. No, it's purely speculative at this point. I think it's something that is a good direction to look at, and if we want to capture a lot of things, we need to go in that direction. But for now, it's, like, first let's do proper strand-based hair, and using that, we can start to look into class and do it proper there.
Yeah, hi. So we know that we are way far from getting what we look like in digital terms, right? But as of right now, say Unreal Engine's meta-humans, right? What would be the best possible way to optimize them and still not lose a lot of quality? Because meta-humans at this point in time with real-time games are not that great, I would say, because there goes a lot of processing power just rendering the character, right? So, according to you, what can be the ways in which we can optimize these things and not also lose a lot of quality?
I think step one is talk to your art director to figure out what you can start to remove and piece out. Like it's the contact with the art department that really you can identify maybe the hairs don't need to be that great and you can remove it there. The thing is also, I think we need to see it on a scale from the time, like we are just at the beginning of these kind of technologies and that's our computing power will only go up. And what is really expensive now will become cheaper as we go, and we're going to buy more stuff on top, so it's going to be expensive again. But it's hard to answer really, but it's really the beginning, and we can only look forward at what it can do in the future.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you guys. Thanks, Thomas, for a
you
wonderful
very much.
presentation. Small token of appreciation.
Thank you.